So I want to do a quick presentation with you about considering sources for your AP European History classroom. These are all sources that I have used or I do use and will continue to use. They do not represent all of the sources that are possible. And so I do want to caution you along those lines. And part of your um, review of these sources is to consider alternatives. These are really designed to fit with my class, and so you want to be mindful of that. And my class is a senior AP um, European history class with students that wind up going to some upper tier colleges for the most part. Um, so this is the short list. The textbook that I use is probably the more challenging of the textbooks that you will encounter for AP European history. It is part of the textbook list. It's called A History of Europe in the Modern World by Palmer, Colton, and Kramer. There are earlier versions of it, but I would suggest that you get the most current edition because, in terms of readability, I think that the earlier versions proved challenging. This was a book that didn't have many pictures at one time, didn't have um, user-friendly sectioning, and so on. It was just it was a straight up college textbook. A lot of changes have been made, especially with Kramer, who has actually been at the AP reading, and we've talked to him individually, and he's a proponent of making things more accessible. But this is a very sophisticated. This is a more sophisticated read. There's a wealth of information here, but it might be a challenging book, and you really do have to act as a filter. Another book that I use is The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by Paul Kennedy. And I use it sparingly. I choose some select chapters. This is a challenging secondary source. It focuses, obviously, as you're looking at it, looking at the title, it focuses on the great powers perspective, and it uses the old paradigm of the winners that write history. But the it is significant, very significant book in the sense that it really brings together a lot of disparate information within a period. And it's because of that, because it is a complex read, it needs to be supplemented and in some other way. But this is something that I use, and I will show you how I use this source. Another book that I use is The Great Wave, and I use this in also a piecemeal way based on chapters, every so often going into uh, a topic that drawing out a chapter that fits in with something that we're studying. This is a much easier read, very understandable. The readability level uh, it's is it's much more readable than maybe perhaps the Kennedy reading, and so it is highly suggested. And I'll show you how I use this text also. This is a primary source book, but you want to be mindful that the new exam, um, even the most recent, any of the past recent iterations of the new exam, relies on stimulus based exercises and for a large part of the exam. This is great because it takes primary sources and groups them into topics that can link up with what you're reading as far as a text is concerned, and it so it can also act as a secondary source because there is a sense in which not only are primary sources within uh, organized by units and topics, but also there are historical analyses from noted historians about a topic, for instance, like the Renaissance. But even further than that, there are images in here, data sets in here, and all of the well, many of the requisite type um, of stimuli that students may encounter on the AP exam. So this is a very highly suggested book. At the very least, uh, if you've never used it, I would suggest that at least you get one copy of it for yourself, and you can choose from it as you will. This is something that I've used not in whole, but in parts, also pulling from it as I needed. This is based on analysis of evidence uh, and using primary sources to kind of build a sense of evidence. It's an older um, text, even before some of the more recent iterations of the AP exam. This is a much older text. This is Documents of Western Civ. It follows from a Western Civ model, but many of the documents still work. And it could also be something that you want to consider drawing from. Many of you may have accidentally run across this if you haven't um, been some deliberately guided to this internet location, which is the Internet Modern History Sourcebook. Uh, and they're constantly adding and changing this, and it's a great tool for you to draw, pick up primary sources or guide students to find primary sources. I suggest that you work through um, uh, at some point in the course, if not in multiple instances in the course, uh, some basic sense of looking at visual images. And so, simple terms and definitions associated with something like art appreciation or art history might be useful. Here, I've pulled um, uh, from an art appreciation course by Professor Jacoby, and some terms and such that might be useful. But I'll hyperlink um, some another PDF that might work along these same lines as may, and it may kind of prompt you to consider some other ways in which you can go about doing this. This is a series that I use. This is Sister Wendy. She was, she was she got a master's degree in English. But she loved art. So you want to imagine this like semi-cloistered nun that winds up looking at some art in a museum, and BBC got wind of it and then ran from it from there. My students tend to be polarized by this, but when Sister Wendy actually passed away, my students did have like a little mini memorial. But it's a very friendly way for you to begin a sense of understanding art. Um, there is a psychological dimension that Sister Wendy brings to an examination of art instead of a formal look. But you might want to consider this along with other ways in which you can complement our art instruction. This is what the uh, some of, especially the higher AP people, like to draw from as a source. This is Gardner's Art Through the Ages. You can get this in one book whole, or you can get this in parts. But it might be also useful to consider looking at that, even just for yourself. I found this uh, this was recommended to me by someone. I've looked at it here and there. It is a useful source, not a bad source at all to consider. I don't use it per se with my students, but I've looked at it. Um, the A great tool, of course, which many of you probably have already been using, is to guide students or to draw from the sources and examination of art history in Khan Academy as a useful source. I actually prefer, or I really like this online source. This is called Smart History, and you have a bunch of PhDs that are really interested in art that come together and examine um, art here. And I think this is a very useful site. Finally, you might want to consider going to AP Central. Um, the AP Central is constantly updated. You might find some sources there that might appeal to you, the way in which you construct a classroom. I want you to take a few minutes and think about other sources that you might have used. What sources that I've discussed might have appealed to you. What would you discard? Maybe you've used something that you really wouldn't recommend to someone at the same time as you would recommend something very highly. Finally, before you go, I want to take a look at something else. For some of you, this is the first time teaching a course. And so I just want to go through my process as far as this is concerned. Um, I've taught a number of different courses, and it doesn't matter whether you've studied um, content in college for years and years. When you construct a course for the first time, if you're interested in getting students to understand that information, you really have to get knee deep into a lot of work. So the first time I teach a course, irrespective of how much I know about that particular aspect of history, it's a challenging, but it's also a great opportunity because there's a tendency for this to be a foundation from which you build from, and so it's both a challenge and an opportunity here. Um, I remember it doesn't matter. Um, Even there was a, for instance, I've been teaching American history for years. I can probably write an American history a book, at least, especially for the first half of American history. But at the same time, the first time I look at a course, I look primarily at the textbook because there's something very traditional about me. I really still believe in textbook-based organization of a course because students need sort of a base or a foundation. In some sense, students are like cats; they need kind of a home base, and that home base, I think, if there's too many things out there, it's kind of challenging for them, and so they need something to go back to. And a good textbook is that thing, irrespective of whether it's online or it's a physical copy. I tend to it doesn't matter what class it is. I've taught at different levels. I feel as though we always want to challenge our students, and we always want to present the higher expectations, raise the bar to a point where they need to jump a little bit, uh, and then build those ancillary constructs. And I tend to think of those ancillary contracts are designed to get them to that point, to help them along the way. Uh, but it is their task to also take the initiative to get there, working through what you've organized for them. Um, Depending on the classroom, you might want to also think about differentiation and how much differentiation you need to imagine. If I teach a class for ninth graders, I will not teach the same type of class for 12th graders. Meaning that if I were teaching European history for ninth graders, the class would not look the same if it was a class for 12th graders. These are two different designs because students are at different stages of development. And in fact, I do teach both ninth and 12th graders. Ninth graders, especially the first few weeks, they are still like in middle school. Um, the So they're in a transition. But high schoolers that are in 12th grade or leaving, they're a different stage of development. And so I've always feel as though I am also teaching to the stage of development. Discipline problems? What? There are. In my mind, when I construct a classroom, the center is the content and the skills. In my best days, I don't think of the discipline problem. I think of recentering to the content, and I firmly believe in unit development. And so, some of the most recent iterations of the AP curriculum have worked along those lines, even though I might organize slightly different units based on my understanding and my sensibility and my mental intellectual map of history. But I firmly believe that you don't want to teach a lesson by lesson. You want to teach unit by unit, and that's a better way of chunking the material and making it sensible for students. So that has to do with my process. I can talk a little further about this if you do have questions.